and needs are, you're not going to persuade them by hectoring and lecturing that they must invest in their home countries and they must send more money home. You've got to know what are the barriers that they see, what are their needs, what are their wishes. And I think enabling governments better to understand their diasporas, their migrants overseas, is going to be one of the most important things to maximize these things. We have done more than 150 studies, mapping and surveys of different groups of diaspora overseas, but of course the knowing isn't everything. The governments then have to adjust and adapt their policies to respond to what they then know of the wishes of their diaspora. Another important aspect, and this came out in the negotiation of the SDGs as well, that will impact on the effectiveness of the Global Compact, is a whole of government and whole of society approach. We heard just now about the importance of communities. It's not just individuals. Individuals do, or families do, receive the remittances, but it's in a community context. And if you also work with the individuals and communities together, you're going to have a greater impact. The importance of local authorities has also been mentioned, and that's something that we've been working on. It was very much recognized during the consultation phase leading up to the Global Compact, the ways in which local governments often manage migration and migrants better than national governments, because they have to deal with it. They know, they see. And we're often told by mayors that governments see migrants as numbers and mayors see migrants as people. And it's because they have to deal with the realities at the local level. And of course, at local level, there is a lot that local authorities can do to encourage investments in the sorts of things that are going to benefit not just the individuals and families, but the communities as a whole. So I would say that it would be good to give a greater importance in the Global Compact wording to the roles and contributions of local actors, local authorities. I mean, another point, if the SDGs are implemented, then the conditions are going to be right, not just for investments by diaspora, but for people not to have to leave as migrants in the first place. A lot has been said during the course of the day today about financial literacy, information, capacity building of individuals to use their money in wise ways. And I think that will be something that will be crucial in the follow-up to the Global Compact, that people have the information they need and can make the choices wisely on the basis of the full range of facilities and instruments that are available. And then capacity building on data collection and analysis in general, because governments cannot make good policies unless they know what their circumstances are. And migration is something that changes very quickly. The circumstances can shift a country from being predominantly a country of origin to one of destination or transit, or any combination of those. And decisions must be based on the real and current circumstances if they're going to be dealing with migration in an effective way, and they must be kept current. And then the impact of those policies must be well assessed, because you can have great sounding policies on paper, but sometimes you can have catastrophic side effects that you hadn't thought of.
Thank you, Jill. And yes, Jill and I have both been in the migration business for a while, and it's fascinating, not just fascinating, but to see these paradigm shifts over time. But I also tend to think that time is sometimes needed for certain ideas to materialize and to develop. Things are not happening overnight, although we always hope that. And so we're all looking for impacts tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. But I can assure you that work like this, in the long term, it is making a difference. At least I've seen that a lot in the past. Thank you for drawing attention to the issue of information for migrants, for focusing on the impact, and the unintended consequences. And one of the unintended consequences that we've been discussing a lot about is the is those of the anti-money laundering and counter-terrorist financing measures, which leads to closing bank accounts for MTAs so that there are fewer rather than more providers of those services, leading to higher costs for transfer and remittances, which goes against the agreements of the governments to lower it. So this is just one example, but I'm sure there are many others as well. But let me challenge the other colleagues of the panel before we really focus on the data issue, which is the third issue, but more generally, Jill was talking about what is needed in terms of research and training for capacity building. So if we look at the breadth of the Global Compact, and if we look at the issue specifically for this panel, can you take 1 or 2 minutes to say, okay, for capacity building, for institutional development, for knowledge building to support the various policies that we are discussing, what in your view is needed? So let me start with Lindsay, and then Pedro, and then Shahadat.
Not data?
Wait, later.
Later, okay. Well, I can say that in the Compact number 19, there's a discussion of the need for more research, and being a researcher, I can get behind that full-heartedly. We need more research, in particular on knowledge transfer, returning to the theme of skilled migration and market segmentation. We really don't know enough about knowledge transfer. We assume it. Doesn't mean it doesn't exist. We know it exists. There's a lot of interest in research the last half dozen years looking at collegial co-patenting across boundaries and collegial co-publication across boundaries. But what we don't know enough about is how those actually evolve out of migrant networks per se. We just know that there's a great density of knowledge sharing across boundaries, and it's been increasing over time. It still tends to be centralized in the United States and Europe. Not surprisingly, a lot of it's kind of going over to China now, but how that evolves over time out of migration networks is something we can sure know a lot more about. And the other thing I think we need to know about is, again, market dimension. Touched on it a little bit earlier. Not everybody buys migration bonds. This is a unique subset of the migrant population. If you want to market to that population, you have to know who the market is, and we really don't know enough about segmenting the market, both at origin and destination and the exchanges between them.
Thank you. And these knowledge transfers is just one other example, I think, of the multiple impacts of migrants and migration. For development, it's much beyond the remittances, so thank you for pointing that out. Pedro, some reflections on research, on information needs in terms of implementation of the Global Compact, looking at the key issues that we're discussing.
We're here today because of research at the end of the day. In 2001, us of the UN member state discovered that this might be more than an anecdote, and then big figures, I'm sorry, people behind, but big figures with a little s with bars on top started to show up, and the more they were, the more interested, and that's fine. A lot of people came around, at least, around that, but that's actually what data did. Research brought more and more of information, I think, to the eyes of politicians, to the eyes of the private sector, because at the end of the day, we were looking at millions of people being underserved. Why we talk about MTOs today? Well, if you have any money transfer organization, they will tell you that banks used to do that, but they stopped doing it. Today we talk about de-risking, but back then they stopped doing it. They didn't want to do so. People had two options: either carry it or put it in an envelope. Both are a little bit of convenient. Somebody saw a niche in the market, MTOs, and do it. So information for the market. I know you're going to. I apologize already.
No.
But
go ahead.
I'm going that the research. Of course, we need to know that, but the private sector needs data, needs research, needs to see the opportunity. They're going to be the ones delivering. The public sector is going to create the sandbox that maybe becomes one beach one day, one public beach where they can go, and the private sector can go and do everything to flourish in that. But the information, the business opportunity, I know it might sound cruel, but that's exactly what is needed. More information for the private sector to see that there's an opportunity. Millions of unbanked that can be banked. That sounds nice. And that type of information is, for IFAD, we tried this year, or we launched a Remit scope to do exactly that, is to try to connect, to showcase the private sector where there's a market gap through data, to basically address the opportunities in rural areas where the competition is low, where costs are higher, and so on.
Now let me drill down one level more. And Remit Scope is a great portal bringing together that information. We expect that the member states will devote resources to the implementation of the Global Compact. Nothing is written in stone yet. But let's look at this region, or Sub-Saharan Africa. Regional observatories. There's some talk about that in Objective 1. Give me 1 or 2 or 3 things that those regional observatories should be doing. What can be done in terms of institutional capacity building to deliver on those issues that you're talking about?
They should work very hard at planning their retirement, and I'm going to explain that. They need to provide data that is going to be so useful that the world is going to realize that they need this on a daily basis. So the data that we're talking, for instance, for Remit Scope, it would be great to see that the market would need that data, that data is useful. And some, not only one, will actually make a living of getting the right data at the right time. You know that today we live in a world of data. It's been discussed over the last month to a great extent. Data is all, and I think this is what's missing. Nobody could care less 20 years ago what you did in the morning, what you ate, what your friends are, and so on. Today, that sells. So the interpretation of data, that data, and one day the data that actually on population migration, actually you can remember at some point, it was not that interesting. Every time you release your data on migration, we're the first ones to click because we want to know, because we know what it represents. And that, I think, is where we need to go. So you still have time, I think, to retire, but one day, that segment of the population, that information is going to become so crucial, and will put so many other things in motion, I hope, in the marketplace, and bring the real identity that they deserve, as you were saying, far beyond numbers.
Shahadat, give me 2 minutes from you. What do we need in terms of, you have a lot of experience working in Bangladesh and some other countries. If you look at the structures, if you look at the capacities, what is needed for international organizations, international financial institutions, bilateral donors to invest in, to address the concerns and to leverage the opportunities?
Thank you very much. Thanks for giving another opportunity. And after Lindsay and Pedro, I have nothing to say, but I have 100 points. But just let me just give me one. I am a strong believer of sustainable programs, less dependent on donor agencies. So we should be looking at, as an academic, as a researcher, that where we can find the models which will stand on itself. If I look at Bangladesh context, where I'm programming now, $15 billion or $30 billion in total, with 15 billion comes through formal channel, another 15 comes through informal channel, 14% of GDP. And most of them are coming from this kind of unskilled laborers. If we skill it up, it could be 100 billion, 50 billion, we don't to the limit. And when I was asking about the funding for the university on this project, in another university, Deputy Vice Chancellor, who is in our team as well, it's a large university, Monash University, Deputy Vice Chancellor, and you are saying, Shahadat, you are talking about billions of dollars. These projects should be self-sustained. We are talking with IFAD that whether we can go the first moving experience, then possibly. So what I'm looking at, the programs which would be less dependent on the donor funding things in the long run. Initially, yes. And second point I want to make, that it should be people-centric. Our program, yet to be finally validated, obviously we have a long way to go, but it's a bottom-up approach. We talk to the people, identify what they need. Let me give you a small example of what they're saying. I was in a meeting, I was in 3 days for Bangladesh, but I managed to go in a remote corner at 8 o'clock at night, 20 people in their yard, and I was asking that what was the problem you have with the government? And they said it's so tiny little problem that when we go to take government card for immigration, health card, it poses big problem. And we are working in partnership with the government. I have senior official for the government, he is from the Prime Minister's office. And the Department of Expected Ministry working with us. So we alerted them that, look, your branches all are, you need to iron it out of the problem. So what we are looking at, that go to the ground, look at the people, talk to them, and ask them what they need. And we should be more of a qualitative researcher than quantitative research. Crunching numbers rather than listen to people and bring the people's voice into the scheme, which we are trying to do now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. People-centered approach, talking to the people, qualitative information, and those are the priorities. Thank you very much. Now our third element, and then we can open it up, is data, and we have already talked a little bit about data, and I don't know whether that electronic tool can be already indicated on the screen, so if people can ask a question remotely, but of course think about the question yourself on those three issues, diaspora, global compact, and data. We've already talked a little bit about data, but maybe more specifically, and that's yet another round for all the panelists. Many countries are suffering from a lack of data, under-reporting, faulty estimates when it comes to measuring the contributions of migrants and migration and diasporas to development. How can we improve the measurement of these contributions? What is the role of the governments, the international organizations? And for that I'm looking maybe at Jill to take the lead on that. Information on the private sector, and in fact Pedro has already discussed that a little bit. What's the role of the private sector in strengthening the data? Civil society, information, Shahadat, you already touched upon the importance of qualitative information. Other actors, Lindsay, in collecting data. So maybe if Jill can start and we just go down the list of panelists, please.
Okay. Well, governments often have huge amounts of data, but it's often kept siloed in different ministries and departments, and they never share it. One of the things that we do when we work with governments to produce a migration profile is bring all the bits of government working on aspects related to migration together and try and get them to share their data at that moment, but also set up the systems to do so on a regular and ongoing basis, so that the policy making by the different departments and ministries is not based only on one aspect that may not take into account many other relevant ones. We're also working with the Economist Intelligence Unit on something called the Migration Governance Indicators, where we dive more into depth about migration policies, covering all the related areas, including access to health and education and all the other aspects that need to be looked at by a government. And through doing that, in some cases, for example in the Dominican Republic, they have completely changed the structures of their government on migration policy decision making, because they see that what they had before was not taking into account what they needed to take into account in order to have good policy making. So there's a lot that one can do with what people already have, but just make them more aware and share more and do it in a regular way. Again, in many cases governments have little idea of what migration is doing at local level, and if governments would enable or create opportunities for regular consultations with mayors, provincial governors, local level people, they would learn a lot more about the circumstances of the country's migration, migrants, use of remittances and that sort of thing. There is a lot that we're already working with DESA to do a lot of capacity building about both the collection, disaggregation and analysis of data. Because again, you can see a lot of figures or you can see a lot of information, but you need to know how to look at it in order then to make the right decisions. And I think that is going to be, I hope, the object of the capacity building mechanism that is currently referred to in the Global Compact. that we build the capacity of governments to use their current data to analyze it better and to collect the other data that they're not currently collecting effectively for better policy making.
Thank you, Jill. To point out that there is already a lot of data around there, it's just not made available. And having worked on data for a long time, it always strikes me, in many countries, the only data that is being released is through the statistical offices. And no doubt that is important, that census data, very useful. Unfortunately, much of the administrative data collected by the ministries, and whether it is on the remittance flows collected by the central banks, or whether it is on entry collected by the Justice or Interior Ministry, or whether it is on exits collected by the Labour Ministry, often that administrative data is not seen as official and therefore as secret. And I think we need to change that mindset, because that is very important and policy relevant information. And thank you also, Jill, for using that one word that I think is absolutely essential in order to not to leave anyone behind in the implementation of the SDGs, and that is disaggregation of data. We have to know the existing data systems we have to try to disaggregate migrants versus non-migrants in order to track how migrants are doing, who are often a group far left behind. Lindsay, your thoughts on data improvement?
There's lots there, so I'm not exactly sure. I would just make one caveat. On compact number 19, where it asks for increased research on knowledge transfer, or social remittances as it's often referred to, I wouldn't want to front load that with too much in terms of what we expect to analyze. I think you want to leave the research element kind of free floating a bit. That's how you get discovery. On the market dimension, however, I think there's a lot that could be done. Exactly how one goes about it, I don't know. I echo this idea that the private sector needs to be involved a bit, a lot, possibly. Most of the data we have on migrants writ large, and much of what you work with, either comes from census data or administrative data sets. Census data, we're not going to change too much. Administrative data on admissions potentially has a lot of possibilities, especially if we were to design small-scale random surveys at the point of contact with migrants. And there's so many places where that happens with the government, or even at the local level. I think we could learn a lot that way. But I've been pushing that, a lot of us have been pushing that stone uphill for a long time. I don't know if it's going to happen, but I think there's a lot of possibilities there. Another place where there's possibilities is something as simple like the Department of Commerce. The intersection of institutions in government that work with the business sector. There's a place where, there could be knowledge gained. There just has to be an interest in doing that. In some cases, it's just as simple as disaggregating the available data by migrant status in some way. And of course, we have to have special purpose surveys. The problem with non-random data, we're not going to go into, we all know. But going to special purpose surveys is a difficulty. I was involved with the World Bank doing remittance surveys done simultaneously in source and receiving country in the Soviet FSU, in Russia, and the stands. And their random sampling methods are something we need to understand a lot better. Rare elements methodologies are possible. Systematic snowballing methods are possible. But there, you're talking about basic science. How do you get the sampling methods robust enough to capture these populations in a cost-efficient way?
Thank you, Lindsay. Censuses, administrative data, household surveys, there is actually a group of academics that have suggested to start a program, something like a World Migration Survey program. But thank you for pointing to the methodological constraints and issues when it comes to survey design, because as opposed to health or education, which the entire population is affected by, migration is a rare event and a costly event if you have to look for them. You want to add something?
Just a couple of quick points too. On this idea of market dimension, there's, differentiating this mass of migrants into what kind of investment niches they might actually fill. A lot of the SDGs are looking at impacts and sustainability, their outcome goals. We need much more research on inputs and also the context of the environment in which investments are taking place. So this opportunity index that IFAD is looking at, I think, is a really important kind of step forward.
Thank you. Looking at outcomes rather than process, we have to be reminded as UN agencies to do that. I'm going to be asking to be very brief, Pedro and Shahadat, because I got already a 5-minute sign there, and I do want to make sure that there's an opportunity for persons to react.
Sure. Since I already answered to data,
Good.
Then I would like to go to knowledge management. What do you do with it? And that's, I think, it's one of the most important part is what to collect and what to use it. At IFAD, what we try to do is to collect information on business models, on what works, then we test it. And then if it worked, then we try it again somewhere else. And we tweak here and there, and we basically try to get a model of intervention that works for the private sector, so that can be promoted. Why is it important? Again, in the business of remittances, for instance, or diaspora investment, it's because sometimes that knowledge gets lost. There's a lot of industry players here, and if I say that in 1994, commercial banks were sending remittances from migrants to their home countries at zero cost, I don't know who knows. Anybody knows that? I don't know. Yes, of course he knows. We found out that in a forum, by the way, in 2005, the first forum held by that man. But the point is, that is crucial information that I'm sure I'm going to be stopped to know. Yes, because there was a business model that made it possible for a commercial bank to give something for free because they were making much more money elsewhere. Knowledge management of that type of best experiences is, I think, the next step. Once you have the data, what to do with it, and the knowledge management behind, I think this is crucial.